Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thrilled to be here. I think before I start, I just want to give a little bit of background on me so you sort of have a sense of where I'm coming from with what I'm going to present to you all today. I spent most of my professional career as a journalist. I've never been a campaigner. I've never worked on a campaign. But thanks to my position at Campaigns and Elections magazine, I do have the great privilege to spend most of my time talking to, learning from, and interacting with on a daily basis some of the best minds in political campaigning in America. That informs what we put in Campaigns and Elections magazine, and it informs the trends that I'm going to talk to you all about today. Campaigns and Elections was founded in 1980. A gentleman by the name of Stanley Foster Reed. I bring this up because it really nicely segues into the first trend that I want to talk to you about today. Stanley founded Campaigns and Elections in large part to democratize the process of running for office. So if you go back to 1980 in the U.S., the modern campaign industry was really just sort of forming. At that time, you had large media consultants, general consultants who were working for only the largest campaigns, mostly presidentials, maybe some influential Senate races, other federal races. One of the largest political consultants in the industry at that time was Roger Ailes, who's now the chairman of Fox News. And he was very emblematic of what the industry was at that time. It was big money media consultants giving advice for a lot of money from their clients. So there was a need for smaller campaigns, and not just folks that were running for state legislative seats or running for school boards, even folks that were running for Congress, who did not have the money to actually get professional advice. The industry had not reached that point yet, and in many ways, we're still reaching that point. I give you that backstory because one of the most significant things that came out of the 2014 election cycle is the fact that we now are able to actually scale some of the digital technologies and some of the tactics that were at work in the 2012 presidential cycle. And it's a tremendously significant development simply because you go back to 2008 after the first Obama campaign, and everybody was asking this question. Can we scale this? Can we recreate the Obama campaign if I am running for state house somewhere? If I'm running for Congress in a district that I don't have a large budget, I'm not appealing to millions of voters, can I somehow be the Obama campaign? And frankly, the answer is no. It was no then, and it's still no now. But the big difference is that a lot of the data and digital tactics that you saw really on both sides in 2012. Despite the Romney campaign being on the losing side, they did many of these things as well. The Obama campaign just did them at a much larger scale and did them significantly better. We now see these tactics down ballot. So there is scalability. One of the most significant things that has happened is a lot of the larger digital firms, firms that worked on both sides in the 2012 presidential race, have developed these self-serve advertising platforms. So if you go back even just to 2012, if I was running for state legislature somewhere in the U.S., I might have a budget of maybe $20,000, $30,000 for my entire campaign. A presidential campaign spends $30,000 on lunch. Just by comparison. So, you know, this is $30,000 to do everything, to hire my staff, to do all the voter contact, if I was actually doing some television or some cable. So that $30,000 has to go a long way. Well, if this was 2010 or even around 2012, I could not do some of the more targeted digital advertising for anything resembling the price that a lot of campaigns were able to do it in 2014. I would need, at a baseline level, maybe $20,000, probably more, if I wanted to do a basic online targeting campaign, say something that voter file targeting using cookies, for example. In 2014, there were campaigns that were taking advantage of this technology and doing it at a starting price of $500. And as you can appreciate, that it tremendously accelerates the accessibility of what really 2 years ago was only the domain of presidential campaigns or US Senate campaigns or larger statewide campaigns that had multi-million-dollar budgets. In a lot of cases, digital firms in the US have created platforms that allow candidates to go on and pick their own target area, pick their own creative, decide whether they want to do display pre-roll video ads, and literally get a fairly sophisticated digital advertising campaign off the ground in an hour at a cost of less than $1,000. It is going to be tremendous. It was significant in 2014 because there were many candidates that took advantage of that down ballot, changed a lot of the thinking on looking at a presidential level campaign and saying, can I actually ever use this stuff? Like, wow, this stuff is really cool, but does it ever matter for me if I'm a smaller candidate? The answer is now yes. We're going to see heading into 2016, that effect is going to accelerate. A number of candidates used this in 2014. I predict that thousands more will heading into 2016. And these are candidates that, as I said, are not just really low down the ballot. They might be running for a school board or a city council race somewhere in the US. But they could also be running a congressional campaign and might not want to spend tens of thousands of dollars for the sophisticated targeting, but now they can do it for a couple thousand. That's what we've identified as the most important trend coming out of 2014, and I think it will hold significance heading in through 2016. It's also a good segue into what we've labeled number 2, and that is this rapid and ongoing shift in media consumption habits of US voters. This should not be a surprise to anyone, and certainly is something that you see accelerated among younger voters. But there are a group of consultancies in the US from both sides of the aisle that have come together each of the last 3 years to run a survey and essentially figure out how quickly folks' eyes are moving away from live television and the more traditional modes of consuming media. And the answer is that shift is happening very quickly, and that shift is continuing to accelerate year upon year. The latest iteration of that survey found that just under 50% of voters say that television is their prime, is the main way, they consume video content. Less than half. 30% of those voters in that same survey said, with the exception of sports programming, they had not watched live TV at all in the last week. Now, that still leaves a tremendous number of voters for whom television is still king, and I'm going to talk about that later. But that is a rapid shift in a short period of time. If I'm a campaign and I need to reach millennials, I need to reach younger voters, this is tremendously significant for me. But it's not just the age component. We're not just talking about folks who are 18 to 24 here. We're talking about 35 to 44. These folks are moving away from watching television as their prime way to consume video content at just as rapid a rate. Mobile adoption is and has exploded. We now have more than 2/3 of the US population owning a smartphone. Half say they own a tablet. The way folks are consuming, even if they are watching traditional television, and this is something that I do, it's rare for me to be watching television, no matter what it is, without a laptop in front of me, without my tablet in front of me, or sometimes without a laptop and my tablet or my smartphone, to be completely obnoxious about it. So I've got 3 screens. So how are you reaching those voters? And as we get to the point where cable television is, in the US, going to be increasingly irrelevant, and I'm hoping that some of my friends from cable in the US don't watch this because they're going to get very mad at me. But millennials, 1 in 4 don't have cable. Many of them have never had cable. it's not something that is in the minds of a lot of young voters. Why do they need it? We consume through Netflix. We consume Hulu. YouTube. I mean, there are so many ways that we can get our content. Who's watching television? Well, for the campaigns that are used to spending hundreds of millions of dollars advertising on TV, this is something that needs to be figured out sooner rather than later. There's also, as a result of this, much less tolerance for the concept of waste in US politics. And by waste, I mean media waste. So if I am running a television ad campaign in the US, if I'm advertising on broadcast TV, I'm advertising by market. So I need to buy an entire market. Now that market may cover part of the state or district or area I'm interested in. In some cases, it covers a large part. In other cases, it covers a very small part. One example of a recent special election in the US congressional district, there were about 10 or 11% of the voters that were encompassed in the main media market that this campaign had to buy. So the campaign is spending literally millions of dollars to advertise on television. And they know for a fact that 90% of the voters watching this ad can't vote for their candidate because they don't live in the district. But they have to buy that market if they want to do broadcast TV. So given all the fragmentation of audiences, given the fact that there are so many avenues now where campaigns can reach voters who are not primarily watching television, can do so for significantly less money than they used to be able to, there is much lower tolerance for all of that waste. And that's going to impact campaign decisions. In many ways, it has been impacting campaign decisions. You will see that accelerate into 2016. There are plenty of folks who are still stubborn on this point, and stubbornness is a top trait of many political consultants. If you have been doing television and buying massive amounts of television, and you've been doing that for 20 years, and you've been winning elections from the presidential level on down by doing so, it is very hard for a digital strategist to sit in front of you and convince you that you should be getting less money, that you should be spending less money on the medium that you have been doing and you know inside and out for the past 2 or 3 decades, and that you have relied on to win countless elections. That's a really hard sell. And that's what digital strategists in the US right now are facing. A lot of people look at the Obama campaign and the tremendous success on the digital front. And I think there are a lot of folks that might wrongly assume that, oh, this means that everybody in the US, where everybody's on board now with digital. You know, we're diverting our budgets. The digital director is my first hire on the campaign. Increasingly, no, that's not the case. And that's not changing as much as or as quickly as it needs to just yet. I hear Democrats complain about this all the time, despite the fact that their party has had this tremendous success on the digital front. Unless you are at the very top, unless you're one of these, whether you're A, presidential campaign, or B, a highly targeted US Senate campaign or statewide campaign, if you go further down the ballot, it is difficult still to get campaigners and candidates in their campaigns to see that digital first, or that digital as a primary way to tie your message together, is really paramount. If it's happening on the Democratic side, it's happening quite a bit more on the Republican side, because the right in the US has not quite caught up to where the left is. They're getting there on the digital, data, and tech front, but the huge cultural advantage that the left has is that they have got digital strategists who have been on the ground now for a couple of cycles. And they've been doing this stuff in congressional campaigns, they've been doing it in other statewide campaigns, and they are able to sort of bring that learning to every race they go and work on. So the left has a much larger digital bench, so to speak, than Republicans do in the US. So for all of the advances, for all of the money that Republicans have put into digital and data, and you saw some benefits of that in 2014, they don't yet have the people power, so to speak. They don't yet have a few hundred strategists that can go and run digital on a contested House race, for example. So that is the cultural gap that Republicans still have to find a way to close as they head into 2016. This sort of ties into what we've identified as number 3 on our list of trends, and that is how the decision-making process in campaigns is evolving and needs to evolve, I think is probably a better way to put it. If you look at it, if you're a campaigner, you've got to be asking yourself, what is the first thing I'm doing in setting up my team, in setting up my staff? A lot of folks in the US think that the first thing you should be doing is figuring out who is going to run your digital campaign. The reason for that being, A, you can get that off the ground much sooner than you can any of the traditional elements of the campaign. You're going to be communicating with voters on social media and online a lot quicker than you are running large-scale broadcast television campaigns. So if you want to get your digital staff first, and you want to get your digital staff in on the ground floor, so to speak, it is very difficult, even now, because campaigning in the US is so siloed, is the way I like to put it. You've got your media, you've got your mail, you've got all of your other disciplines, and very often in the decision-making process, in the budgeting process, none of these folks are talking to one another the way they should be talking to one another. If that happens at the start of the campaign, if that happens when you're putting together your staff, if that happens when you're setting your budget, if people aren't talking then and communicating then and integrating everything they're doing in the campaign, then that's going to happen once you start campaigning. And it's going to happen at critical moments. It's going to happen when you need to tweak your message, when you need to make sure that you are communicating exactly what you want to voters. If you don't have your strategists at the table, understanding one another, talking to one another in very substantive ways, you're in big trouble. So this is changing on campaigns in the US. If you talk to most digital strategists, they will tell you it is not changing quickly enough. But it is changing. Just 4 years ago, digital strategists, didn't even have a seat at the senior strategy table. If there was the campaign manager, the general consultant, the media buyer, digital strategist wasn't in the room. The digital director or whatever the campaign might have been calling them a cycle or cycle and a half ago, they weren't sitting there with the major decision makers of the campaign. Much of that has changed, but it hasn't changed everywhere. It hasn't changed nearly as much as digital strategists in the US would like it to change. And the importance of it is that everything, when you are talking about messaging, there needs to be that integrated approach. I've heard from digital strategists who will say, I don't just want the campaign's first hire to be a digital director. I want the campaign to think about every hire and say, does this person have the understanding they need to have of digital? Do they have the awareness? The communications director. Is that person somebody who is well-versed or well-versed enough on the digital side of things? And are campaigns actually thinking about that when they're making their hires? So I think what you'll see heading into 2016 is not only will the digital directors and the top digital strategists have those seats at the table, in much larger numbers than they ever had before. But they will increasingly be among the first hires on the campaign. They will also increasingly be involved in all of the major conversations that take place around messaging and around strategy. And that's critical, because that siloed approach that I mentioned a couple of minutes ago always bleeds into your decision-making process in campaigns. And it's been a problem in the US for some time. And I can't tell you the number of consultants who have complained to me, especially on the digital side, that even if they're heard in that strategy room, you've got a media buyer or a direct mail consultant who just goes and implements their own plan anyway. So, of prime importance for campaigns in the US in 2016 is making sure those voices are heard, making sure that you're running an integrated campaign, that everything you're putting out messaging-wise is backed up with every other medium in a way that is planned, in a way that reinforces your campaign's message, in a way that allows your campaign to more effectively respond to an opponent's attack, if that's what you're in need of doing. And I think you're not only going to see that at the top level in 2016, I think you're going to increasingly see that on down-ballot campaigns. You'll see it on congressional campaigns. You'll even see it on smaller state legislative campaigns, because it is of prime importance now. My number 4 is something that I think to most folks is probably going to sound obvious if you are observers of US elections. But the massive amount of money in US politics is getting ready to get much larger. And by massive amount of money, let me just put a little bit of it in perspective. 2014, just television advertising, $1 billion spent on TV ads. US Senate races spent more than $300 million just on TV. Gubernatorial races in the US spent more than $400 million just on television. That doesn't count anything else that the campaign has to do. One thing we saw in 2014, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, which is the Democratic Party's campaign arm for House races in the US, took to sending an obnoxious number of fundraising emails to supporters. And by obnoxious number, I mean several a day sometimes. They had these horrible subject lines that all caps screamed at you, urgent, impeachment, because apparently President Obama was on the verge of being impeached. As a tactic, it worked. The committee raised tens of millions of dollars off of these emails that, frankly, treated voters like idiots and made them feel like they were nothing more than an ATM. The committee kept using this tactic because it worked so darn well. There are some serious long-term implications potentially for what that means for online fundraising, because if I'm on the receiving end of that and constantly the committee or any party or any campaign is hitting the panic button over and over again and saying, if you don't donate $5 now, Republicans in the House might move forward with impeachment of the president. And I give you my $5, and then next week maybe I give you another $5, and then next week I give you another 10, and then I give you 20. Eventually, I'm going to be really sick and tired of the fact that you're asking me to donate for something that isn't really a reality. So the risk is that you burn the folks on that fundraising list. And that's of significant concern for a lot of Democratic consultants. I bring this up because one of the reasons that the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee did this was obviously they needed to raise a heck of a lot of money, but B, because their spending was being completely dwarfed by these outside groups. what we call in the US super PACs, or political nonprofits that are organized under a section of the US tax code. They're often referred to as 501c3s, 501c4s. They weren't just spending at the same levels as the party committees and the candidate campaigns. They were spending significantly more. One of the most highly targeted US Senate races in 2014 was in the state of North Carolina. The outside groups, super PACs and other outside groups that were spending to advertise and were spending on other electioneering for that race spent more than $40 million above and beyond what the candidate campaigns spent combined. That was something that played out in several top US Senate races in 2014. So it's not just that the outside groups now have some power. It's not just that the outside groups now have the ability to spend hundreds of millions of dollars. It's that they have the ability to spend significantly more than what candidate campaigns can spend. And amazingly, what national parties can spend. Heading into 2016, the Koch brothers, who are a pair of conservative businessmen, activists, and donors in the US, they have built over the past several years an impressive political organization that is wide in scale. They spent in 2014 around $500 million on the elections. They intend in 2016 to spend almost $1 billion. If indeed they spend $1 billion running TV ads and financing get-out-the-vote operations and whatever else their various political organizations will do, that means they are, in all likelihood, going to be outspending both of the major party nominees for president. That's a possibility. They could also be outspending, and are more likely to outspend, the national parties. This is something that we haven't seen in the US up until the last couple of cycles. Recent Supreme Court decision paved the way for this kind of spending, but it is undoubtedly going to accelerate as we get towards 2016. What does it mean for campaigns? Well, for the most part, it means that campaigns need to start messaging earlier. One of the things that the Koch brothers political organization did in 2014 was that they spent money very early on television ads targeting a lot of US Senate Democratic incumbents. They had the resources and the money to spend on advertising targeting Democrats long before many of those Democratic campaigns actually were organized enough to say, should we be advertising on television? A lot of campaigns probably didn't even have that conversation before the incumbent or the candidate turned on the television and saw an attack ad running against them, more or less. It changes the timetable for campaigns in a way that alters that early decision-making process. And it's significant in any number of ways for the strategists working on that campaign. If we're spending earlier, what are we allocating? If we need to message earlier, how are we evolving our message? Should we, if we've got an attack, when should we be using it? Used to be that if you had something great against your opponent, you'd use that in the last 72 hours. Well, because in the US now we have so much early voting, if you used a great attack against your opponent in the last 72 hours of the race, chances are more than 60% of the electorate's already cast their vote, so it's completely useless. So this moving up of the calendar creates this sort of ever-present campaign that you always need to be raising the money and you always need to be figuring out how you're spending and how you're talking to voters. The last one is more of a reality than a trend, but it got my number 5. Despite everything that I talked about earlier in terms of the evolution of the digital culture in campaigns in the US, folks who are increasingly not watching live TV, folks who are watching on 2 screens or maybe even 3, folks who are time shifting what they're watching and therefore missing a lot of ads, The reality is that the media spend in 2016 is going to look a heck of a lot like it did in 2012. Television and broadcast television is still going to be king. And hundreds of millions of dollars will still be spent advertising on television. We have not yet, despite a lot of cracks, despite a lot of holes, in the sense that when I'm blasting that message on broadcast TV, I know I'm missing a lot of my voters. Depending on where I'm blasting that message, I might be missing more than half of my voters. Might be missing the vast majority. It does not prevent campaigns in the US from grabbing that megaphone and spending hundreds of millions of dollars on television. And that's exactly what's going to continue to happen in 2016. Now, campaigns will be smarter about it. They will be more targeted. If they're not, then they're likely to lose. There are some things that I think by 2016, campaigns will actually be able to do to really target their television in more significant ways. Coming down the pike is something called addressable TV, where campaigns can target using cable set-top boxes. And if I want to target a specific ad to a specific household, I can. And even if that person's neighbor is watching the same program at the same exact time, I can actually give them a different commercial than the person living next to them is watching. So television is getting smarter. Consultants are getting smarter about it. But it's still the megaphone. It is still king. And it will still be for 2016. One thing I'll leave you with, underlying all of this, I think the biggest lesson that Democrats learned in 2014, and they probably knew this, most of them knew this beforehand, but technology doesn't win elections. Technology is about the margins. In a very close race where tens of millions are spent on all sorts of mediums, technology can move those few thousand votes you need to win. But technology is not winning you an election. Democrats in 2014 spent massive amounts of energy, and they spent a lot of money on sophisticated digital targeting, modeling in a lot of these US Senate races. Folks who worked on the Obama campaign in 2012 came off of the campaign and opened a lot of their own digital consultancies and firms. A lot of these firms worked for the likes of the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee to try to find ways to help Democrats hang on to the Senate. They were doing modeling and other sophisticated digital tactics and targeting for the DSCC and for Senate campaigns. It didn't hold back that Republican wave that you saw in 2014, because in the end, as significant as digital data and technology are, it's about the margins, and it's not going to win you a race by itself. With that, I thank you, and happy to take any questions anybody has.